All right, so assuming you've created your game and you've started everything in Unity, this is kind of what it's going to look like when you open it up. And what we're going to talk about today is really the first level in creating your terrains and kind of how to start editing those terrains. Now, one of the things that I need to say as I start here is you always must have a sketch. And it's really important for you to come up with a map to kind of understand what your terrain is going to look like. And it also just helps you plan things out. You know, I find that as you continue to work, if you don't have a plan, it's going to come back and it's going to bite you every time, every time. So here's what we're going to do. So in order to put a terrain into our game, we're going to go to Game Object menu, and we're going to say 3D Object, and right down there should be the terrain. If the terrain doesn't show up, then that means you haven't imported the correct assets, and you need to import the environment package, and that will bring in terrains and all sorts of other stuff. So if there's anything that you don't see as we go through this process, everything that I'm using is packaged with Unity, and that means that you didn't import the correct assets and asset packages, and so that's something you should do. So we're just going to go to 3D Object, and we're going to add a terrain. And it's going to show right up, and I like to double click on it, and it will kind of center me right over it. And you'll notice in the inspector, all of a sudden, we're going to have a whole bunch of new options that have kind of showed up. We're going to talk about each one of these tools that is kind of lined up right over here on the right underneath the terrain. And we're going to talk about how to kind of work with this. Now, the first thing to understand about the terrain, it literally is a plane. So that if I go underneath it, you can kind of see that it's see-through from underneath. That's pretty typical for 3D objects. If you don't understand why that is, that has to do with the normals of the object. And if you don't know what normals are, that would probably be something good to kind of go out and research on Google. But the normals of a plane in 3D animation are really important, and the normals here are facing up. The other thing that's good to know about terrains as we start is that in Unity the terrains are basically at their lowest level. So if I wanted to have kind of a riverbed or a lake or something like that, I kind of have to raise the whole thing. At this point in time, I actually can't lower my terrain. So let's just go to the first tool, and then maybe you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. So this first tool over here in the terrain, you can see here, I click on it, it says raise or lower terrain. And when I do that, this has been a problem with Unity if you haven't saved it and closed it, for some reason it doesn't like to allow you to edit terrain. So I'm going to save my scene as scene 1. And let's just save the project. And it's just a little bit of a glitch for some reason. If I click on my terrain and I click on these tools, it won't allow me to do anything unless I close and open again. So if I close it, and then I'll go down here and we will open up Unity again. Oh, there's the icon. So I'll open up Unity again, and I'm just going to click on my new project that I created here just for this demo. Oh, it wants me to type in my... We'll just work offline for the time being. So let's see, directional light. So it's building at the light map here. And now, once I've opened it, it seems to want to let me allow it to do it. So there we go, and I'll bring my opacity up here. And by changing my brush size and my opacity, what it allows me to do is it allows me to start building, you know, mountains, hills, whatever. So let's just say I wanted to have lakes or a river or something in my scene. The best way to do it is to kind of get myself a base level and then subtract from there. So if you notice over here, which is where it's kind of the original level, if I hold the Shift key down, that's supposed to allow me to lower the terrain, but you notice it won't allow me to lower it here, only in places like this. And that's because this is the lowest that it can be. So in order to do things like a riverbed or a lake or anything like that, I need to raise my terrain all up to a very a set level, and then I can lower it again. So what I'll do is I'm going to take I'll take this here. I'm going to use the second tool, which is a paint height, and what it allows you to do is it allows you to set a height based on clicking with the shift key held down. So I'm going to hold the shift key down, and I'm going to say I want everything in the plane or my terrain here to be this height. So I'm going to shift and click, and then I'm going to increase my brush size to maximum. And now you can see as I go along, everything is going to be at this same height. And I'm just going to paint everything here like this and kind of get everything together. And you can kind of see how that works. It just paints everything to the set height. Now, one of the things that I should mention is right over here, it has set that height based upon when I shift clicked. If I wanted to, I could manually change the numbers or slide the slider if I wanted to do something a little different. It's good to know those numbers or use them if you need to match up two terrains. That can oftentimes be very helpful to know that number. Write it down, take a screenshot, whatever you want. I've used that a couple times in the past when I needed to match up a couple terrains. So I'm going to zoom back out here and get everything kind of set up the way I want it. So I'm just going to keep painting. I've got my biggest brush size here, and I've got my fullest opacity. So I'm basically going as fast as I could here with this. And there we go, just about done. So now, one of the other things that I feel like is really helpful when I'm building a terrain is actually getting a texture on it right away. So you can kind of see right now, it's kind of hard to see what you're doing. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to skip over this tool right here. We'll deal with that in a second. We're going to go to the paintbrush button, and this is painting textures. I'm going to click the edit texture button down below, and I'm going to hit add texture. And then this is going to show up, and you're going to have a couple different two different options. You're going to have your RGB values here, which is a color, and you're going to have your normal. And here it says assign a tiling texture. This is actually really important. You must have a texture that is seamless. If you're going to search for your own textures and bring them into the assets folder, that's fine, and I can do a demo on that later. But what's really important is you make sure that your texture will be seamless. In other words, it will tile, repeat, and repeat endlessly without showing the seams. If you click the select button, this is going to open up here, or select our texture. You can increase the size of these textures and start scrolling through them. One of the important things to note is that you'll see two different kinds of textures. You're going to see one that looks like like this. It says muddy rock, and then you're going to see the muddy rock, and it's going to say normal. And that actually has to do with the idea of a bump map, a normal map, and just a color texture that's going to go over top. So if I were to let's just say not select the color here, and I was just going to add the normal. So let's go to our muddy rock normal here. I'm just going to click on that, and then I'm going to go, oh, see, it won't even let me. So let's just click add and see if I can maybe click none. So no, it won't let me do that. Oh, you stinker. So maybe I just wanted a flat color. It's not going to let me do it to illustrate my point, is it? Jerk. Oh, there we go. So it's got a checkerboard now, and you can kind of see that. But what you should also see is even amongst the checkerboard, you can see that there's now a bump to the texture. In other words, the normal map has actually given what is a flat plane a bump to it, a texture to it, where the shadows work. And if I were to grab, let's see if I can get the directional light here. If I were to grab the directional light and start to rotate it, we should see the shadows change, yeah, on our terrain. And the reason for that is because it's actually giving it a bump, and it will cast shadows dependent upon the direction of the light, and so on and so forth. Now, it's really good oftentimes for bump maps and the color texture to actually coincide. So I'm going to click on this, I'm going to edit my texture, and instead of this stupid checker, I'm going to go back and I'm going to find the muddy rocky color texture here, and then click apply. And you can see now that repeated texture, and you can see it repeating, is going to match the normal texture, which is underneath it, or the bump map. And that's going to give me not only the appearance of a texture because of the color, but it's also going to change the shadows. So again, if I take my directional light here, and I grab it, let's bring it down a little bit here so I can see it a little bit easier. And if I rotate it again, you will see, as before, how the lighting will start to change because of the way the bump map is set up. So it's really cool, and that's really important, and I think that's really important for your first textures, to make sure you've got a normal as well as a color texture on there so that you have some sort of shadows. But the other nice thing about textures is they're layerable, and so I'll go over that in just a second. But for now, what this also helps me do is, now that I'm starting to work with my terrain, it's also going to help me see the three-dimensionality of the terrain a lot easier. So as I start to raise up sections to make mountains or hills, you can kind of see what's going on a lot easier. Let me undo those really quickly. One of the other things that's really important is changing your brush size as well as your opacity. The opacity can actually be really important because it allows you to make more subtle changes. That may not look like much, but if I go and drop a first-person character in there, you're going to see that in actuality, that's probably a relatively large hill. Let's do that. This is a really great test. So we're going to go down here into the Project tab. We're going to open up the Standard Assets folder. We're going to go into Characters. And if you don't see that, again, that's an asset package that you need to import, which is under the Characters. And also, I always import the cameras as well. And there's a First Person. And then you go into the Prefabs folder. And right here is First Person Controller. We're just going to drag that right onto the terrain. And it will put us right there. If I double click on the terrain, or on the FPS controller in the hierarchy, you'll see that it's going to show me where it is. And you'll also notice sometimes it plops you like half in and half out. So we're going to put ourselves right here. And actually, just by zooming in like this, you can see how big that hill actually is. But let's just take a quick gander at this by hitting the play button. And now I can turn my character around, and you can kind of see how big this hill is compared to my character. Now, one of the things that I think is frustrating about Unity is the size of the textures according to the size of the first-person controller prefab. If you're going to use that prefab, one of the things that I recommend is that you scale it. So I just hit the escape button to get my mouse back. Make sure I've selected the FPS controller. I'm going to go over to my inspector, and I'm just going to scale it up 2, 2, and 2. And then I'm going to have to grab it and kind of put it right back on the terrain again. But now if I hit the play button, you'll see that the height looks a lot better. The scale of the texture according to everything looks really good now because my character is a lot taller. That makes this hill a little shorter, but at the same time I think that the scale overall is good. So I almost always take my first person controller and scale it up to 2. Alright, so now we're really ready to start building our terrains. So I'm going to hit escape, hit the play button, get back to my scene, kind of set myself up here, and click on the terrain, and now go back to my tools. So now what I can do is kind of maybe increase my opacity a little bit, and I can start building hills or mountains. Now, one of the important things to also realize is at some point in time your character is going to see the edge of your terrain. So one of the things you want to think about is, what's going to happen when my character reaches the edge of the terrain? Or do I want to let them? Am I going to put some sort of a natural defense or a natural boundary or a border that my character can't climb or can't do? If my character just moves to about over here, he's going to see the edge of the world, so to speak. There's lots of different ways to solve that. Really tall mountains. You can do colliders that will be physical, that will keep your character from getting to a certain point. But one of the things that I've always noticed is the corners show up pretty obviously. So if I take a look here and I just go towards a corner, let's see, where's the, yeah, this is probably a corner here. So I'm going to run towards the corner. See, as I get closer and closer and closer to a corner, you can see it pretty obviously that there's going to be an edge coming up here, and the corners will show up you know, pretty easily. So these are places where you definitely want to put like hills or mountains or something like that at these corners to kind of hide them, and then let them kind of roll back down. In my experience, let them roll back down a little bit so that the edges of the terrain are actually hidden from view. You know, and that'll oftentimes help things a lot. You can hold the shift key down and get over here and maybe take my brush size down a little bit and get this part here a little more lower there. That looks good. And let's say we wanted a lake in the middle here. Excuse me. So that's where I'm gonna hold the shift key down and I can kind of create a little bit of a lake. I don't like that. So I'm going to undo a little bit and create a little bit more of a rounded. We didn't want it to be so flat there. There we go. You know, and then you could have a riverbed coming into it or something like that. You know, there's just a lot of different things you can do with the terrain. It's really cool. Holding the shift key down is really great. To be able to lower the terrain and kind of come up with some really good changes in elevation. There are also all sorts of types of different types of brushes in here too, and they do some really cool stuff. So if I take this, it kind of makes these like spiky little things. If I take you know, one of these brushes here, again, it does these kind of like really nice little textured things. You know, especially if you're kind of trying to create like a desert wasteland or something, that can be really powerful. Take the opacity way down, and it really brings in a nice sense of texture in places. Whoop, that was way too much. Yeah, bring the opacity way down. And it can bring in some nice texture into places where you might want some rockiness or something. You know, and each one does a little bit of a different feel, and you just kind of have to use them and get used to them. One of the things that I really think is important is after you've done some changes, since you've got a first-person controller in there, now you can kind of turn around and start seeing what's happening here. So I can see the edges of the lake here. I can run around the edges of the lake and this what's going to be the lake bed and kind of take a look at some of the things. I can go over here and check out some of these rocky sections that I've kind of created. And it looks really good, actually. I mean, it looks really good with these. And it's starting to kind of like, almost kind of looks like the moon or something like that. It's kind of neat. And again, you can kind of see that they become a natural block to keep your character in certain places where you might not want them to be. So anyway, you can continue playing with all those little brushes and everything like that and create a really nice terrain. Now let's go back to this tool here is the smooth height tool. I kind of think of it as an erosion tool. I think that's kind of why it's got a water droplet icon. So if I click in here and take some of these areas, and if I just kind of click it, you can see it kind of, it erodes. It takes some of the sharp edges away from some of the things that I've already built in there. It's a tool that I've found is really easy to go too far with and regret that you used a lot of it, but at the same time it's really handy for some other stuff. So you know, it's a great tool to have. You play with the opacity and how powerful it is. It does some really nice stuff. And especially when you have, you know, cliff faces, or you know, something like this where I'm going to have a lake or water in here. Sometimes the edges get kind of jaggedy, and when that happens, this smoothing tool is a really great tool to have. So now we've kind of got a start to our terrain. Let's take a look at a couple of the terrain or texturing techniques that I like to do. So I laid out a nice base, which is my muddy rock. But the nice thing about the terrain painter is that it works, it's really cool because you can add textures on top and kind of have layers. So now I don't need to worry so much about the normal, but what I can do is start working with grassy textures. So right here I'm going to have grass and rocky, kind of middle road, and then there's a grassy hill. So I'm actually going to work these in order from right to left here. I'm going to add some grass and rock here that's going to allow me to kind of create a transition from the muddy rock to the grassy rock and then to a grassy like hill. So I'm going to add that, click OK, and then I have my brush. I'm going to kind of increase my brush size, keep my opacity down a little bit here, and it's going to allow me, let's see, that's not quite strong enough. Let's keep increasing it until I see what I want to see here. Getting there a little bit more. There we go. A little bit more. So it's starting to add this. Oh, wait, I always do this. So when you do that, you create a new texture. Guess what? It doesn't actually change the texture. It doesn't like select the texture that you just chose. So now I've got to choose that. Let's go back here in the opacity and strength. There we go. We can increase that a little bit. There we go. And you can kind of see how I'm creating a slightly different rocky look that has some grass to it. Okay, and I'm going to avoid my lake here, and just kind of add little swatches of this this rocky grassy texture here, with a little bit more opacity, and you kind of see how that's going to start coming out here. Actually, I'm deleting it now because my target strength is pretty low. I'm going to watch that target strength. That thing is powerful. It's like it doesn't do anything, and then all of a sudden you get it to a certain point, and all of a sudden it like takes over. And then again, it's good to take a second and look at the texture that you've got with your character. It's looking pretty good. Escape, hit the play button, and now I'm going to go ahead and add another texture, and we're going to get that this grassy hill. Add that. Going to take this, and then I can start putting patches of that in. Oops, see, I did the same thing. It's not selected. There we go. And I can start putting patches of this grassy thing in here. Try and keep it, you know, light. I can keep painting on top of it. It makes a nice texture. So these hills are kind of grassy, and then I'm going to let it fade out as it gets to these kind of rocky hills. Oh, see, took the target away. There we go. And you can kind of see how this is already starting to look. Let's play. And we can kind of see we've got a nice grassy look to it. And then we've got the rock for underneath, because that would make sense. And then as we go over towards these rocky sections, the grass will go away. And again, that kind of makes a lot of sense. And then I can go even further than that. So this is looking pretty good. And one of the nice things about painting these textures on top of each other is you start to eliminate these lines, you know, that are going here, which are you know, indicative of the repeated texture. It's kind of nice to be able to try and get rid of those as much as possible by kind of painting your textures, adding a little bit here, adding a little bit here, there, and then I'll add a little bit more strength, you know, to the grassy texture in certain places so that it gets even stronger, you know, and allow it to be even thicker and darker in certain areas. And then again, I'll just test it, and then I'll try a little bit more or less, and I'll test it, and then, you know, same thing. The other thing that you can do is you can put trees and grass in here. So let's take a look at the trees really quickly. So here's our tree tool, for lack of a better word, and you can edit the trees, and you need to add one, and it says please assign a tree. So you're going to go up here to where it says tree prefab, and you're going, it says none, and you need to choose a tree prefab. Unity comes with a couple, you know, palm trees, broadleaf, desktop or mobile, so it's got different memory issues, and then a conifer here, so you can just click on one, double click, and then add it, and then what it does is just like painting on it's just like painting on the textures. You have a brush, and as you click, it's going to bring in some trees. One of the things that I've learned is that trees really do eat up a lot of processor cycles and GPU stuff. So, you know, the density is really important. The other thing that I like to do is I like to randomize my tree height a lot, you know, a little shorter, a little bit higher. I like to kind of let them go. You also can increase the random tree rotation, which really helps. That way they look a little different. So when you're standing there, you're not looking at 10 trees that are all facing you exactly the same way and are identical trees. And that's really high density, so we're going to take the density down a lot, and just kind of have a few trees kind of sprinkled out amongst here, like that. And then again, just like before, it's good to just test it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the play button, and now I've got trees, and you can see it skipped there for a second. These trees are pretty heavy duty. One of the things that I love about Unity is you can see how the trees are kind of growing vertically out of the hillside there. It does a really nice job of it. So it's pretty cool how it works, and it does a really great job, and seems to work really well. And you can run into them, and you have to like kind of move around them. So it's pretty well done. You can download other tree packs and that sort of stuff too, so you don't have to use the ones that they actually have. The other thing that you can do is there's also a paint details thing, and this allows us to do some grass. So I'm going to hit edit details. I'm going to add a grass texture. Go up to my detail texture, click here, and then you find one of the grass fronds. I really like this. Double click, click add, and again it gives us a nice brush here by which we can kind of increase our size, the opacity, target strength, put that back up, and now I can like literally paint why is it bigger before? It's kind of funny. I can paint some nice grass in here, and it doesn't really show up at first. It's just kind of frustrating to me. Let's get our target strength up here. But as I click, it sometimes it just doesn't show it until you go find it, and there it is. So I can go ahead and see this, and it's kind of blowing in the wind, which is pretty cool. It kind of looks a little bit like we're underwater, but and then also is kind of just ends rather abruptly, but it does a pretty good job. So that's how you can add grass. You can also change the color of it. So if I get out of this really quickly, maybe oh, there you go. So you got to zoom in to really see the grass. If you zoom out, it doesn't show it to you. So if I edit my details, you can see your color here, healthy color, dry color, and so on and so forth. It's a really neon green color. So I might take my green color here and kind of get it a little bit darker. Yeah, I like that better. There we go. And then my dry color, I might make a little bit less, you know, maybe a little bit of a paler green, something like that. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that either, but it's working a little bit better. and then you can hit the apply button and you can kind of see how it changed the color of the grass. So you've got a lot of options with that. You can also paint using different brushes too, so it's like splotchy grass and that sort of thing. And if you want to get rid of it, you hold the shift key down and you can start getting rid of it by painting again. And you can do the same thing with the trees, actually. I forgot to mention that. So that if I go back to my trees here and click on that and I want to get rid of some trees, I can just hold the shift key down and it gets rid of some trees with the paintbrush. So that's pretty cool as well. Lastly, we've got this little gear here at the very end, and this has basically all the technical attributes of the terrain here. There's all sorts of stuff that you can kind of play with. And I'm not going to go over a lot of that. That's more of an advanced level thing. The one thing that I will do or talk about really briefly here is notice you've got a whole bunch of wind settings for grass, the speed, the size of the wind, how much it bends them. So that's kind of nice. You can kind of like make it like a little bit less powerful or more powerful or whatever. The other thing that I like here is the terrain width and the terrain length. Sometimes 500 units is not quite enough. So you can take your terrain and you can make it 1,000 by 1,000. And you'll notice that that stretches it out pretty heavy duty, but it certainly makes it a lot bigger for your character. Keep in mind that this increases your memory requirements for the game and all sorts of other stuff. But if you're willing to do that and you want to make it a little bit bigger for your character to have to walk through so they don't get to the edge of the map in just 30 seconds, then that's probably something that might not be a bad idea. And then down here we have detail resolutions, control texture resolutions, and base texture resolutions. Those are things that you can probably Google and read about a little bit more. I usually just keep them where they are at. The other thing that you can control is the height of the terrain. Right now set to 600. Again, I usually leave that to be the same and just allow that to to stretch out as I need to with the paintbrushes. But there's just a ton of stuff here that you can kind of play with as far as the terrain is concerned, and I don't know, it works really well. So that's the basics of the terrain. I know that's a lot. I mean, holy cow. But it's actually really cool because it's very powerful. Terrains are very powerful in Unity, and what you can do with them and how easy it is to do stuff in Unity with the terrains is awesome. We'll go over water and other stuff like that in a future tutorial. One thing that I should probably say too, when it comes to scaling up your terrain, I have found that it is oftentimes better to use the gear here and change your terrain width and length down here under the gear rather than scaling it up. It just seems to work better. You can do either and see what happens, but I do find that actually just using the gear and changing the size of the terrain here makes a lot more a better result. So anyway, that's the basics of getting your terrain in. Just to review really quickly, you add the terrain from the game object menu, get it started. It's at its lowest level, so if you need things like water, like a lake or something like that, you've got to lift everything up to a certain level and then subtract where you want a lake or anything like that. I also find in review that it's excellent to take your first-person controller prefab, drag it down onto your terrain object, and test your scale, especially mountains and hills and stuff like that. What looks like a little tiny hill here, once you actually play the game, will end up being a huge hill that your character has to climb. That you just didn't realize that the scale was such. So I find that really helps out a lot. And then 3, just be mindful of resources as you're adding trees and grass and stuff like that. It can really eat up your GPU cycles and make things a lot slower, both in the editing but also when you're playing the game. And then just, all these different tools do wonderful things, and you can have a lot of fun doing awesome stuff with your terrains. So that's that. If you've got any questions, You can leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. But hopefully this was a good and easy tutorial just on the basics of using terrains in Unity.